to another episode of Inside the Recording Studio. I am Jody Whitesides, and with me as always is Mr. Chris Hellstrom. How are you today, Chris?
Doing good. How are you, Jody?
I'm working on something musical, so I'm feeling pretty good too.
Well, that's a good day when you get to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Today we're doing almost like a follow-up piece on what we did last episode. We talked about MIDI, and we're going to delve in a little bit more into that, and we're going to talk about editing MIDI drums and programming MIDI drums.
Exactly.
This was brought on by your recent excursions into some old remixing, or remixing some old tracks, I should say.
Yep.
And some issues that you had.
Instant revelations, not even instant revelations, but revelations on how to tweak.
Right. Today, when you do your tracks and when you're writing and composing, how often do you program by hand your drums? Because we have some great tools now to
We have great tools now. So yeah, I don't really do a ton of programming. I do a lot more tweaking than I do programming. When I'm doing that, the usual intent, depending on where this is going, for an artist thing, if it's for me, I will program it out so that I can give it to a drummer and say, this is where I'm going with this. You play it.
Right. Well, in a perfect world, that's what you want. But sometimes stylistically, that's not what it calls for. So that's not always the best thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
But
for production thing, it's generally programming it out and thinking, okay, this is the beat that I want. And if I can't find it in one of the awesome tools that we have now, then I'm going to write it out and then perform it by hand.
Yeah.
Which is slow, but it can be done.
You get exactly what you want, right?
Yes.
Yeah. When you're doing the automatic route, you're primarily using Drummer and Logic, as a launching point.
I am.
Yeah.
There are some good jump-off points, and there's a lot of flexibility in being able to manipulate that drummer, so to speak, or the drummers that they have, where you can mess with the swing, you can mess with the feel, all before they even play. And even by making slight tweaks to some of the settings, you can mess how they play fills and all of that stuff. So it's really quite something. From there, I take the playing, turn it into MIDI, and use it somewhere else.
Go from there, yeah. Yeah, no, it can be a good starting point. I have to say that it took me a while to warm up to the idea of the Logic drummer because I felt that the way that they implemented it was kind of dumb and just sounded because they had like the names of the drummers and, Stu is in an indie band and he worries about credibility. It's like, give me a fucking break, just give me whatever. But if you can ignore that, it's a pretty cool tool, especially to get ideas down quickly.
Yes, I don't disagree with that.
Yeah, I am actually one of those sadists that likes to program by hand a lot of times. Don't get me wrong, I do use like the Logic drummer for ideas sometimes, and I'm also an avid Superior drummer user. I mentioned that a lot. So those are my go-tos generally. I like to start off when I do parts because I generally hear a part in my head that I kind of want to get at. And I'm not super comfortable playing all the parts on the keyboard at once. That would just be a mess more than anything else. So I tend to lay down kick and snare patterns first.
As most people tend to do.
Yeah.
Even with MPCs and other type of drum machines, it's generally easy to do part by part than it is to play the entire thing with multiple fingers at once.
Yeah. But some of those guys with MPCs, though, they're like crazy into doing that, and they got that down. I am not that guy. So
no, I'm not that guy either. It's impressive when you can do that.
Absolutely. But I'm definitely like a kick and snare kind of guy. Sounds obvious, but stylistic choices that we make are obviously dependent on the song. I scale down on the amount of kicks I use because that's something that I have a tendency to perhaps overdo, just to get something that works with the song. And I mentioned kicks there because that can be something that we have to really pay attention to. What I mean about that is if there is a part already down, let's say that it's a guitar part or a bass track, we have to make sure that it works while we're placing those kicks, so it actually makes sense in a musical way and not just like, oh, here's a cool groove. Yeah, that works great, but nice groove, but it doesn't work with the track. So it sounds obvious.
Save it and put it in another song.
There you go. Yeah. That's where I start. Then sometimes a part calls for like little ghost snares and things, like depending on where they're going to be. But I generally don't put those in now, so I'll leave those out. But then I turn my attention to hi-hats and if there's rides or crash rides and all that kind of stuff and start tweaking with that.
Right.
If you're doing it by hand, is that kind of like your workflow as well? Or
Yes. Very similar. Kick, snare, hi-hat, crashes
yeah,
in that order.
right. Crashes to me come a little bit later, actually, because I'm starting to thinking about beginning of sections or after fills and things. But now here's something where I think just about any drummer will agree with me on this, is that when people are sloppy with their hi-hat programming, it's a dead giveaway that it's a programmed part. Yeah.
Yeah. I won't disagree with that.
Biggest giveaway, let's say that you're doing like a 16th note pattern, right? Let's say for sake of argument, you have a snare on 2 and 4, where a lot of times you would hear just there's those 16th notes on the hi-hat, they're just going. But you have to move that right hand to get the snare. So it ends up changing those patterns. Those can feel like, well, that's a glaring sort of like amateurish kind of a mistake to do because we don't think about it. So it sounds cool. It's not realistic if we're going for realism.
Whether or not you want to be real, that's a big part of what you're programming, right?
Sure.
Some people don't care, so they do it anyway.
Yeah. Stylistically there, I think if you're doing 80s synth track, you just want those hi-hats going, and it's not necessarily like a realism type of vibe, right? So in that case, yeah, by all means, keep them going there. And it
Well, I'd
might
say
just
the
sound
same
cool.
for EDM and hip hop and other things.
Sure. Anything where it's, I guess, more electronics based.
Yeah. Doesn't matter
Yeah,
for the realism on that.
right. So I go into hi-hat parts then and take special care and make it sound good. Today with drum samplers and instruments that we have, there's generally so many different hi-hat hits in there. Not just velocity layers, but different types of opening of the hi-hats and all this kind of stuff, and paying attention to those. So that would be my next step. And then rides on top of that. If there's a section, maybe a pre-chorus, you go to the ride or whatever happens to be.
Sure.
What's another thing that is a big no-no for you when people are programming their parts?
If the thought is towards realism, you can't have more than 4 things going on at once on the drum kit and
maximum,
such.
yes.
Because that's all you have for limbs. You have 4 limbs, so only 4 things can happen. One of the things that I can tell about if somebody is programming something is the way drummers tend to keep time. The hi-hat is often being controlled by the foot. As a quarter note pulse or an eighth note pulse. Those hits aren't nearly as loud, but they're in there. And then you mentioned snare ghost notes. Those things are also things that drummers do to keep the rolling vibe of whatever groove that they are doing.
Absolutely.
Another thing to pay attention to is not have everything smashing at 127 on the volume scale of the current MIDI standard.
Yeah.
That's a dead giveaway that it is not real.
Yeah. What you're getting at there as well is with 4 limbs, right? That's not always necessarily true because, again, with that 16th note thing, you think, well, that's not 4 hits, right? It can be done. Well, it can't be done that way because when they're playing 16th notes, unless they're rapid fire with their left hand, right? You got to make sure that a drummer can actually play the part. I know where you're getting at, but if it's
extremely difficult to play the hi-hat and the snare at the same time on a 16th note pattern.
Right. Not saying that somebody probably can't do it, because we've probably all seen those guys on YouTube.
No, a
but
dude
generally,
from Spain that can do almost anything on the fucking drums. The guy's amazing.
Yeah.
But he's a rare case.
Yeah. I would even stretch that further as into the next part that I move into at this point when I have like sort of like my arrangement, my group mapped out, is I start moving into fills.
Sure.
Right. Whether that's just going in between sections or whatever, or just points of interest, hitting certain spots in the song, wherever it's called for, But here, again, make sure that it's something that a drummer can actually play,
Yep.
right? Taking into considerations, whether it's tom rolls or whatever happens to be. Is that something a drummer would do? I know I'm not alone in this, but I pay special attention to how the drummer would play with their left and the right hand when it's time to kind of switch to a different tom, let's say, right? So whether it's a triplet pattern or whatever it happens to be, but just doing like a little bit of thought into that. For me, what really helps is, although I'm not a drummer, but if I imagine sitting behind a kit, how would I actually execute that?
Right.
And chances are, if I can do it, a drummer can do it. So that's a good measuring
One would
stick
hope,
for me.
right?
Well, yeah. When it comes to fills, do you have a go-to method that you do, or do you generally? No?
I don't. And I would think more along the lines of musicality than I do straight up fills, if that makes sense. More like a Ringo Starr, even though I don't want to even compare to that because that guy did what he did and he was very fucking good at it. Or a Jerry Gaskill, the guy from King's X. His parts are generally so very musical with how they do their fills and what they're doing and their grooves. I think more along those lines when I'm doing fills. It is not typical of how most drummers would think when they're doing fills.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something that I've asked drummer friends about advice.
Mm-hmm.
It could be little things like, well, what would you tend to do in this situation? Would you play this, or what would you consider? You always have a kick behind a crash hit, for example. Little things like that, just to make it more what a drummer would do. Because
Sure.
I think just as we're learning an instrument, whether that's piano, guitar, or whatever happens to be, we have to put a little bit of thought into how drummers play, I think. Listening to your favorite drummers, like you mentioned, like Ringo, it's like super musical guy, right?
Right.
And then taking ideas from that, it's like, oh, I would never think of doing a fill like this or even a part like this because, again, I'm not a drummer, right? So listen to stuff and take ideas from there and make sure that it's doable and it sounds cool, right? Because that can certainly open up avenues when you kind of like programming your parts. Now we got a structure, we got parts that we're kind of happy with, we've done some fills. Now, what did you do if you're in this position?
Work on humanizing it.
Yep.
So that everything feels more human rather than mechanical. Though if it's something dance related, it probably requires that mechanicalness over
needs
being
mechanical,
human.
yeah.
Yeah. The idea, though, for most of the stuff that I deal with is human-oriented performance, and that requires changing where hits go minutely in terms of where in the timeline it's hitting. It also requires working with the velocity of how things are hit as well.
That's a big one.
Those are the two things. It's just the slight timing discrepancies and the velocities.
Yeah. Let's start with the timing discrepancies there when we're changing that, because that's obviously at this point, that's where I do as well. I go for more the humanizing feel here. How much are you generally moving stuff? Because this is usually measured in like ticks, right?
In Logic, it's measured in ticks, and those ticks can vary. I wouldn't be moving them very much. You're talking maybe 10 maximum.
Yeah, me too. Like 10 plus or minus whatever happens to be. Right. Yeah. And what about velocity levels?
Same concept here, depending on the part of how hard it needs to be hit, versus I don't think generally need to be hit as hard as, say, choruses.
Do you still do that on both kick and snare type of thing or whatever it is?
Yeah.
Yeah?
All the drums get that value because the drummer's not going to play it full 100% power the entire time through a whole song. Some songs might call for it, but it's very rare.
There's a little bit of a stylistic difference there, I think. Yeah, I'm with you in that if you have a chorus that's going to be like real slam, and it's nice to be able to take that up, just even if it's just a little bit. I think.
And then to answer that, it's usually a range of probably about 15 velocity levels So if max is 127, I might be going down to about 112-ish in that range. Maybe if it's in a particular section, it might only be about 8 different velocities in there.
Yeah. And this is something we talked about this before. Today, obviously, with the tools that we have and whatever engine you're using to trigger the samples, like there are so many more samples in each kit piece.
Yes.
So you get that dynamics more than, early stuff. It might have been like a soft and a hard hit, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then it would just be different levels between that. So now with the velocity levels are being increased to at least, I would say probably in certain cases, about 20 to 30 per kit piece, you can get a lot more realism and dynamics out of a performance.
Yes.
You mentioned that having everything like slammed at 127, that's another thing that to me is a big no-no. But I think when people start out, it's easy to do that because we're like, this sounds cool. What's that?
Because you want things to sound consistent, of course. It's like that consistency factor right there is just hit it as hard as you can all the time.
Yeah. And so, why doesn't it sound like a real drummer? Well, because that generally doesn't happen.
Right.
That's the first thing you want to start playing with velocities. On the flip side of that, so when we learn that lesson, people tend to have too big a discrepancies in their velocity
It can happen,
levels,
sure.
right?
Yeah.
And then it just sounds weird and it's like a disjointed
Uneven.
performance. Right.
Yeah.
That's another one. While we're talking about this and placement and things, a couple of tips I'll throw in here that I've discovered that makes a huge deal. And you kind of mentioned this when we were talking about the remixes you've done.
Mm-hmm.
When things are not exactly hitting at the same time,
Yes.
right? A couple of things that are really, really good is that when you're hitting two cymbals at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Pull one back in time a little bit and delay the other one a little bit. Because chances are that when they're hitting it, it's going to seem like they're hitting them at exactly the same time. But if you spread those out a little bit, maybe just like 5 to 10 on each side. 10 on each side is probably too much. It adds that realism to hits, and
Yes,
you can
it
actually
does.
hear that it is two cymbals being hit.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one like little cool hit. Then obviously, let's say that there's a snare roll or a tom roll. Velocities are super important, right?
Yep.
Drastically changes the feel if which one am I hitting first? Is that one going to be louder or harder hit than the second one or vice versa?
Yep.
Drastically changes the feel there. So
It sure does.
velocities are important. That's a whole bunch of programming it yourself, either via keyboard or map, or you're just mousing them in. A few things to think about when you're doing this. You recently been doing some remixes, as mentioned several times, where things were recorded with an electronic kit and were done with V-drums.
Yes.
What were the first couple of things that you had to pay attention to when you were starting to deal with all that data? Because that's a lot of data that comes in through those paths and things. And some of it useful, some not.
I had at the time created a template within Logic that allowed me to channel each drum and its appropriate controller data that went with it. Some of them had it, some of them didn't. The most prominent being the hi-hat, the other one being the snare, and then the other beyond that is the ride. All that data is filtering through these transformers in Logic that shifted it to individual MIDI tracks that were for a particular drum. I did that so that I could control the data a little bit better than the first album that was recorded without that template. Everything had to end up getting separated and then hopefully not getting lost in a time shuffle if I were to copy data to move it to a new track, so to speak, which can be easy to do if you're not keeping an eye on things. You can really mess things up if you don't keep that data in line, so to speak.
Right. Is it
And
a
that
tool or
data
is it a
is-
weapon, right?
Yes, it's a tool or weapon. Part of the data is the actual note hit that channels to a particular drum to be hit. For most things, if you're using GM, which is standing for General MIDI, they have specific drums for specific notes. As you've noted in Superior Drummer, they go way beyond that because they have way more hits to deal with. Some drum plugins also have an option for V drums, as they are generally thought of as the most common electronic kit. So they have a setting for that. The V drums have a type of data that you can use for different hits. Thus, you need that to be playing back appropriately. The biggest factor to the V drums that makes it sound the most real in what you can do is the way it works with the hi-hat and the foot pedal that it has. It's spitting out an enormous amount of controller data to tell the hi-hat how open and closed it is.
Yeah, because all of that, correct me if I'm wrong here, Jody, just to interrupt here, but all that controller data is still triggering off the same key on your keyboard. So it's not like, well, it is triggering a different sample, but it's not moving from like F sharp 1 to G sharp 1, that kind of thing. It's still the same thing, but then the expression information is actually just triggering the same sample. Is that how that works?
I'm not sure how Roland does it inside their own head. The answer to your question is not 100% the way that you explained it. The hi-hat on the V-drum kit has multiple notes. I can't remember what they are off the top of my head, whether it's like F sharp and G sharp and A sharp or whatever it is. There's 3 main ones, and then there are 2 that are way off in another location. And those control where on the V-drum hi-hat head it's hit, whether it's open, whether it's a foot close, whether it's a shank, whether it's a bell. I think there's a bell one. I'm not sure. They all relate to each other as a group. And on top of that, there is the pedal data. That is the continuous controller of how open or closed each hit is.
Right.
One of those is the act of closing the pedal. By stomping down on the pedal, it actually triggers one particular note sample. But anything else is where it's been hit on the head with a stick. So it could be an A sharp one, it could be an F sharp one. And I'm randomly throwing those out. It's not necessarily the notes that it's doing. There's 5 different note hits that it has to the V-drum hi-hat, and then all the foot controller data for the real time of how open and closed it is at any given point.
Yeah. Point there is like there's a lot of data that comes in to trigger the appropriate sample. This is also something that you can do with Logic's drummer, where you can control. So instead of having to program each hit, here's going to be slightly more open, here's going to be slightly more closed, that type of thing, you can have it done with expression data that you're sending underneath as well. So it's a similar concept there. You're getting a lot of data from the V-drum as the input there, and that created some challenges for you, because now I know that with some of these performances, you wanted to time correct some of them, or at least tweak some of them.
Yes.
So you had to make sure that that controller data now is
moving along with it appropriately.
There you go.
Most quantizing literally only affects the note hit, not the controller data. You have to be very careful about that, or at least that's what I was going for when I started doing a little bit of these time corrections. It's very easy for the snare, and it's very easy for the kick and the crashes and the toms. They generally don't have a lot of data going with them. The snare has controller data. Unfortunately, I cannot find a drum plugin that reads where on the snare it's hit by the V-drum. Only the V-drum head can do that, apparently.
Yeah.
If somebody knows otherwise, please let me know. I would like to know before I do any releases of these things. The other thing that does that is the ride cymbal can tell where it's been hit, but no drum plugin deals with that. Really, the only data that plugins tend to work with is the hi-hat open and close kind of thing, and which sample you're using, whether it's a shank or a full hit or a closed hi-hat or a half open, whatever it is, and how open it needs to be. The rest of the kit to quantize is relatively easy, but quantizing the hi-hats and retaining the feel of what the drummer's doing with the foot control is not so easy. And hopefully your drummer is sharp enough and well enough on the grid, so to speak, that you don't have to worry about it a whole lot. But if you don't worry about it, you can change an open hi-hat to a closed hi-hat with the movement of one click,
Yeah.
one tick. That's all it takes. And you could screw it up completely.
Yeah, not a pleasant situation to be in, because then you go down that rabbit hole and you're creating more issues than you're
Then you're
attempting
solving.
to solve, right? Yeah.
Yes.
It's tricky there as well. Obviously, when somebody is playing on an electronic kit, they have the feel, and you don't necessarily have to worry about velocity levels and things like that, programming things. It's just done for you by the actual drummer. So that's great.
Yes.
But there can be issues with that as well if it's not triggering properly or whatever happens to be, or timings are, in your case, slightly off and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So what are some points that you would give to people when they're programming drum parts?
If it requires realism, make sure that a drummer can actually play it. Otherwise, sky's the limit.
Yeah.
That would be one of the things I would say.
Yeah.
And
I would say on that note, though, because then you're people like me that are like listening to all this like metal shit, where drummers today can just do these amazing things, right? Don't assume that a drummer with that technical ability is going to do a crazy techno death metal fill in your country track. It's not going to sound good, right? So using that argument, it's like, well, a drummer could play it. Yeah, but it needs to be appropriate too. So
yes.
What else?
Another thing that I mentioned in terms of correcting things in previous episodes, velocity makes a big difference. And which particular sample you're using also makes a difference. Case in point, several of the songs that I've been dealing with, the drummer was using a rim shot snare hit for a lot of it and occasionally missed the rim and just did a snare. That sounds drastically different than a consistent hit.
Sure does.
Thus, you need to move to a new note to keep the consistency. Then within that, if everything is being hit so hard that it's full volume, it's probably not a bad idea to randomize the velocity a little bit, maybe within a range of 5 to 10-ish in velocity levels, so that it doesn't sound like it's just constantly being hit at full volume. As we mentioned, that can sound very robotic.
Yeah, definitely. The biggest takeaway here is always like velocity. Pay attention to your velocity. Is it going to be full on thing? Then you want higher ones, but don't be afraid to back those off as well, right?
Yeah.
So it makes it a huge thing. Same thing with the timing. The biggest caution here, I would say, is slight discrepancies are great because it can add to the realism. And again, move away from the roboticism that we can easily get. Taking all these things into consideration, you can end up with a really good performance that's just a programmed MIDI part.
With that, we'll move on to our Friday finds. Chris, what have you got this week?
I saw something online that I thought was really interesting, because on episodes where we talked about amps and things and recording guitars, the name Dumble comes up every once in a while. And, you know, I think there's like 10 guys that own Dumbles, right? Vertex is a company that does guitar gear and pedals primarily, like a lot of custom stuff and things. And they actually have a pedal now that gives you the sound of a classic Dumble called like the Steel String Supreme. Vertex now have a pedal called SSS Double Preamp Stomp Box. Get it? It's double. So, but actually, that's a play on words on Dumble, obviously, but it actually has two kind of functions in it as well. And I thought that was really, really cool. So if you're going for that Dumble sound, you don't have to find one and then sell your house. You can just get this pedal now. And I think it's at about $250. So I thought that was really, really cool. The SS Double Preamp Stomp Box from Vertex is my find for this Friday. And what do you got for us, Jody?
This is for those who are creating their studio, like actual physical space. If you're doing it correctly, you're going to have acoustic panels, hopefully made of things like Rockwool or Owens Corning 705 or 703. There is a company that makes these things, and you can buy them. It's ATS Acoustics, and they have a new thing now in that they will custom print images on the coverings of the Rockwool and fiberglass.
Nice.
You can now get your family photos put on there, studio logo, a nature scene, modern art, whatever it is you want to put on there, they can custom print the covering for your acoustic panel. That's what I'm going with this week.
That's cool. That's a little bit off kilter, but yeah, you spend so much time in the studio. You want to keep remembering that you actually have a family there. So, yeah, very cool.
While we've got your attention, we ask that you go to InsideTheRecordingStudio.com and sign up for our mailing list. You'll need to be on our email list in order to be eligible for future giveaways, and we'll make sure you don't miss any future episodes of this amazing podcast. Send us an email at goldstar, GOLDSTAR, at InsideTheRecordingStudio.com with the word velocity, and you'll get something cool back in your inbox. If you have a topic or suggestion for Chris and I to explain in a future episode, contact us at the contact page, and we'll put it into consideration for a future episode. With that, I'll say see you next week.
Have a good one, everybody. Thanks for listening.